Good afternoon from the Würth House, Berlin, and a warm welcome to our environmental policy debate on the Carbon Border Act. I'd rather prefer to welcome you in person. As we all know, the circumstances about Corona do not allow that, unfortunately. What a mess. Dear deputies, dear panelists, dear Günther Oettinger, dear colleagues and friends of United Europe, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us despite the US election. However, the European policy must move on. And here comes my statement on it. It's a statement explicit from a liberal point of view. Ladies and gentlemen, it is undeniable that carbon emissions must be reduced, and that worldwide. And this can only be achieved if European industrial societies are taken along on the path to the proclaimed climate neutrality by the year 2050. The economy, the companies are not the problem, but part of the solution, if you just let them be. Brussels is a key to it in view of the fact that the member states have different views regarding sustainability. The initiative and ambition in climate policy is increasingly shifting from the national to the European level, which has become evident since the European Green Deal at the latest. A higher carbon reduction target, delivery pressure for national energy and climate plans, stricter carbon limits for new cars, the green taxonomy for the financial sector, and many more. There are no limits to the political theoretical outbidding competition, also not in physical limits. The European Parliament even surpassed them. In any case, it has approved by a large majority the tightened carbon reduction target of 60% by 2050, compared to the base value of 1919. That means it's in just 9 years. However, it is not explained in detail or even proven how this could be technically achieved. Make a wish, how childish. What all these initiatives have in common is that they are political initiatives, also party political initiatives presented from an internal perspective. The realities of cross-border economy activity seems to be faded out, as the technical scientific experience seems to be. In fact, it is only the engineers, physicists, process engineers, product designers, up to the market departments of the companies who can do the job and also do it. And on top of that, on their own expense and risk. And it's not the political loudspeakers, because they are only used to deal with money, mostly a hell of money, which they obviously do not have. I mean, depoliticization is becoming the order of the day. The correctness of the claim becomes obvious against the background of the latest Commission initiative, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What means in real nothing more than tax. These taxes are added to the respective national taxes. They come on top. There is no doubt about it. Now the Commission is running into debt itself, raising funds of 750 billion euro on the capital market. To expect, I fear, without an upper limit. In order to be able to repay the debt, if even intended, the Commission has gone deep into debt policy. So it has a vested interest in tax revenues per se. So now a carbon limit tax to compensation. the so-announced carbon border adjustment mechanism. In fact, nothing else than taxes, I told you, Bryce, which according to experience are paid somehow, albeit reluctantly, in order to vanish into some kind of households. Taxes raise the overhead costs added of all stakeholders and are finally passed on to consumers. I mean, better is leave the money at the enterprises. Don't skim it off the market. Enterprises do research and foster development. They are more efficient and purposeful. Now more than ever before, innovations, vital companies and their engineers, expertise and know-how are required. This is how social, ecological restructuring of societies works. I'd like to draw your attention to our counterposition to the Commission's border tax adjustment is as simple as it is effective. I mean, only commodities, goods and services that correspond to the European carbon footprint may be sold on the internal market, irrespective of whether they come from domestic production or from third countries. This results in mutual cross-border projects. Both sides are equally involved, a market economy approach that ensures a level playing field in terms of competition and regulatory policy. Most compatible with the WTO rules, because it does not involve any discrimination. Politics sets the regulatory framework within which companies can operate and start the competition open search for the best technical solution. In other words, research and development. The technically best solution for reducing greenhouse gases, that's the market binding standard, regardless of its origin. This is how international market mechanism works. Let the market take up competition, and we will see a competition for the best processes and most effective methods, as we can currently observe so impressively around the world in the race for corona vaccine. The reward for these efforts is market access. It would be possible to start with internationally comparable products such as aluminium, rolled steel, or cement. All of these industrial products require a great deal of energy. And the parameter? The harmonized basis of assessment is a thermodynamic limit value. Physically determinable and objective comparable all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, a wide field is opening up. I look forward to the debate and the results of your deliberations, which shall be incorporated, hopefully, into legislation. The goal is definitely worthwhile. If we follow the rules of the market economy, emissions will fall, thereby strengthening the economy and societies. Let us unleash the forces of the market. Let us fostering competition. I would be really pleased if you found more reasons to realize our proposal than reasons against it. I think the proposal deserves your attention. Thank you for that. I'm looking forward on your fruitful remarks. And now it's on me to hand over on the moderator, Ms. Katrin Witsch of the Handelsblatt. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kurz. Hello and welcome on this special evening. Mr. Kurz already mentioned it, and we're switching to English because we have a few English-speaking people on the panel. The US election is still ongoing, so you won't know the final result until tomorrow. And of course, its results will be the topic of the upcoming days, if not weeks. But let's not forget that there are other important issues to talk about in our own region of the world. And although this event had to be transferred into the digital space, I'm very glad that still so many of you chose to take part in it today. My name is Katrin Witsch. I'm an energy correspondent for the German economic daily Handelsblatt, and I will be your host for the next 60 minutes. And before we start with the discussion, I would like to hand over to Günther Oettinger, former European Commissioner for Budget and Human Resources, who will lead us in with a quick keynote. Mr. Oettinger. You have your mic is on now.
Dear moderator, dear co-host and friend Manfred Kurz, dear panelists, dear guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'm happy that the Würth Group, a family-owned company, and Unite Europe is organizing this digital event. And thanks to all participants and mainly to the moderator and to the panelists. Two thoughts from my side at the beginning. First thought, the ambition. No doubt, climate change has to be a priority, the priority for all global politicians, for the global society, and so for the European Union in special as well. And we are not coming from zero. For to know what is our ambition, we have to see where do we come from. It was in 1990, third times all emissions of our today's EU28, the kingdom included, have been 100%. From 1990 up to 2018, 2019, we could reduce by 24, 25%. Means 29 years, minus 24%. Not bad. In parallel, our economy has been growing by around about 60%. And no doubt climate change policy since the Barroso II Commission are more and more a European responsibility in a European single market with a European emission trade system. And so it's, I think, important, and I can back this, that the von der Leyen Commission is ongoing, leading the process. It has to be a European decision, a European common understanding and priority. 29 years, minus 25%. The Juncker Commission said, let's go to minus 40% in 2030. Means additional 11 years, minus 15%. We doubled the speed. And what we must know is in the 1990s and beginning of the century, we could shut down old-fashioned factories, Soviet factories. This process can't be repeated. It's a process which ended meanwhile in the eastern part of Germany, in Bulgaria, in Poland, Slovakia, and so on. We doubled our ambition. And now, as Manfred Kurz said, the Commission said at least minus 55, Parliament at least a 60% reduction. And I'm concerned, is there really a reliable impact assessment? I don't think so. What does it mean for the agricultural sector, for the energy sector, for the automotive sector and mobility, for our industries, for our commodity producers, for housing and our buildings? I did read a lot, but I think this process from minus 40 to minus 55, at least minus 55, minus 60%, was very ambitious. Is this process really realistic? What we have to do is to be ambitious and realistic. What we should avoid is to destroy our industrial course. Europe is no more in lead if we see industrial production, high-tech production. And we shouldn't lose the process against China and India on the one hand, and the US and others on the other hand. My second thought, whatever is our ambition, minus 40, minus 50, minus 55, minus 60%. What we have to avoid is carbon leakage. Because steel, aluminium, cement, copper are commodities we need for windmills, for buildings, for manufacturing, for machines, for electrotechnical tools, for cars and trucks, and so on. And I think it should not be a closed shop, but Europe should be able to produce these high-tech tools inside our EU, and not just to import them from outside. So we should avoid carbon leakage. But if we have rules or energy costs which are much higher than in India, Russia, or in China, we will lose the competition, no doubt, because nobody is willing to pay more for commodities which are in a global market. And so here is coming the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or carbon border tax, as Manfred Kurz said. I'm wondering, is this instrument really realistic? I'm wondering. First of all, Europe, as always, has been an open market. And we are coming to more and more trade agreements for exports and imports, and for to reduce all the costs of exports and imports. This adjustment mechanism would be the contrary on the one hand. Second question, is it online with WTO rules? I asked as a member of the Commission in 2017, 2018, because the idea is not so new, is it online with WTO rules? Online with our existing trade agreements? My experts have been quite defensive. I'm wondering that meanwhile, the Commission is so offensive. Same people, so offensive. I'm wondering. And what I would like to do is to ask really legal experts, which problems, legal problems, political problems we will have. We should avoid trade wars. We should avoid to be isolated. We shouldn't go into a corridor. And take commodities, steel or so. Maybe it's quite simple to see which tax would be needed. But take a car from Hyundai, from South Korea, with a lot, 10,000 parts inside, components and parts, coming not just from South Korea, coming from Valeo, France, coming from Magna, Austria, coming from Bosch and Conti, Germany. So components being produced in our EU, being exported to South Korea, the car is coming back. Does anybody be able to calculate the tax for a car with 10,000 or more parts? I don't think so. It's too complex, it's too bureaucratic. No, let me say it's crazy. Sorry, it's crazy. And the next point, if you take steel or a car from China, I'm sure the Chinese will give us a certificate, a guarantee that this car is produced just by electricity coming from water, from hydro, coming from solar and wind. And they can guarantee it, because then they will produce their own cars for the internal market by coal to power, by nuclear, by gas. They are more clever than the Europeans are. Then don't underestimate the cleverness of our Chinese partners. And if there's a certificate, we can't avoid to import it, the car. Or we will have a problem, a trade battle or a trade war. And Europe, and mainly Germany, and the Würth Group is a German group, and I'm a German as well, we need exports to all these growing markets, to China, and we have to be careful. And so I think, firstly, climate change is the most important political challenge. Second point, we have to be ambitious but realistic. Third point, we have to be smart. And we have to see how to avoid isolation in a coral, how to hold doors open to global markets for exports and imports, how to avoid a trade war. And here, all I can read from the European Commission, and I like this institution, doesn't convince me. So thank you, Manfred Kurz, organizing this panel now. And the moderator, please take the floor. I'm sure it's not the last discussion. It's a first discussion. And so my colleagues as panelists, I would like to meet you whenever feasible, physically, maybe in spring in Berlin or Brussels, because we have to continue and we have to deepen our exchange of views. It's a very important challenge. And we are at the beginning of the complete discussion in our society, in our political institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Oettinger. And as you just said yourself, nearly everybody agrees that the goal should be climate neutrality till 2050, but it isn't clear how we can get there. And this one topic has been heating up the debates on how we can achieve that goal, and that is a possible carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that's exactly what we want to discuss here today with you, our viewers, and of course, with our panelists. But before I introduce our guests, please let me encourage you to take part in this discussion by sending your questions using the F&A tool that you can find on the mid-bottom of your monitor. There will be some time for your questions in the end as well, but in my experience, these digital events work best when you can engage at all time, so please do. And now for our discussion, I want to welcome Edis Perlot from the Center for Business Taxation of the University of Oxford. Good evening. David Boublil, the Deputy Head of the Taxation and Customs Unit at the European Commission. Mr. Martin Schneider, Head of the Association of the German Cement Industry. And of course, Günther Oettinger and Manfred Kurz will be joining us in this discussion as well. And before we start, a quick reminder, although we are discussing online, that doesn't mean that it should be less vivid. So please interrupt each other, be impolite. Let's make this as real as possible. Having said this, I'm going to address my first question to Mr. Boublil. You are here as a representative for the European Commission and you are working on the practicality of this question. Mr. Boublil, the industry has made it very clear that they want to achieve the European climate goals, but many of them don't want the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Why do you think this instrument is necessary?
Okay, thank you very much for this question, which indeed is relevant, very relevant. And I'll start saying that, well, we have received contributions from the industry in the context of several consultations that we've done. The first one that we've done in March, and another one that closed just last week. So we receive different messages from different industries, and I would not say that there is a uniform rejection of the carbon border adjustment by industry. Well, what I would say is, as indicated already by several speakers, the EU has decided to become carbon neutral by 2050. In this context, the Commission has put forward the Green Deal, which is a very broad package of measures that touch upon all aspects of the economy, which is about innovation, financing transition, which is about sustainable transport. And one important element is achieving climate neutrality. In this context, there are instruments for carbon pricing, instrument to make sure that carbon emissions are subject to a price in order to encourage those who emit carbon to reduce their emissions. And we have, for the last 15 years in the EU, the emission trading schemes that puts a price on carbon, but it puts a price on carbon only on the emissions of installations within the EU. And in the global market, in an open economy that the Commission continues supporting, well, if the EU raises its climate ambition and the rest of the world does not, there is a very serious risk of carbon leakage. And that's why the carbon border adjustment should not be seen as a magic wand that would allow reaching climate neutrality. It is one instrument among many other, and its objective is ensuring that we can raise the ambition in the EU, we can have more demanding objectives in the EU, while ensuring that this is not undermined by carbon leakage that would well, yes, undermine the effectiveness of the measure. So we are in the process of assessing. We have consulted the industry. We have some industries who are very much supportive of carbon border adjustment. Some are less supportive, but the objective is that to ensure that the price of import reflect the carbon content of the product. And we've been clear from the beginning that if we do it, we'll do it in a way that is compatible with the WTO obligations of the EU and with the other obligations of the EU under free trade agreements and other international obligations. I know that some have, well, had issues with the fact that it has been said that the receipts of the carbon border adjustment would go to the own resource of the EU, but this does not change anything to the fact that it is a climate objective. It is a climate measure. We are consulting the industry. We will take into account the consultation that, well, what we have received as contributions in the context of our consultation. We are aware of the risk of trade war and retaliation, and that's why the EU is willing to engage as much as possible with all its trade partners across the world to ensure that the approach to reducing emissions is as collaborative as possible, and that the measures that we would put in place would not be perceived as protectionist or as going against free trade. So really, it should not be seen as one measure. It should be seen as a measure reinforcing the approach we have to carbon pricing in the EU in a way that is not undermined by carbon leakage. But the industry should be reassured. We're looking into the contributions that they've sent, and we will continue engaging with the industry in the context of the impact assessment of the measure.
Speaking of the industry, Mr. Schneider, the cement industry is one of the most carbon intensive industries, and it is going to be one of the first to get involved with this adjustment mechanism. The EU argues that it wants this to help create a level playing field for industries like yours. Would you say this is the right instrument, or one of the right instruments?
The key word is level playing field. I mean, listening to the debate, I think it's clear what we anticipate here is a very, very complex process. And there's certainly not one size fits all measure. Yeah, and it's not applicable maybe to all industries, to all sectors, to all products in the same way. And I think we have to look here at the diversity of the products, of the markets, and in this respect also to the measures. I mean, cement is from those products that have been highlighted here, certainly among the commodities. And Mr. Oettinger, you have said this is a commodity, and just telling you cement is this gray powder, it's a glue basically, yeah. And if you produce it to a standard, it's the only differentiation that you can have is its price. Yeah. And cement is unfortunately very CO2 intensive. This is indeed true. So we contribute to 6 to 7% to the global CO2 emissions, and that's a big burden that we have. And in order to compensate this, we are covered by the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And in that scheme, you may know that there are some sectors which are subject to carbon leakage and others not. And cement is from its very first beginning subject to carbon leakage. And the reason is that cement, and if I would ask you now, what is the price for a kilogram of cement? And if I tell you it's 10 cents per kilogram, you get a feeling, for the price of that product. And if you compare the price of the product to production, to transport costs, for example, and to CO2 cost, you very easily come to the point that for a small amount of CO2 cost to be added to the production cost, you can transport the cement far distances. Already today, because in the ETS, we get some of the allocations free under the ETS, as you may know. Yeah, but 15% in our country we have to buy already. Yeah? And this is already a significant cost. And if we have a carbon price of 30 euros, for example, you almost end up at the 3, 4, 5 euros. And I have to say that for 15 euros, you can transport a ton of cement from Turkey to the Belgian border. That's maybe not affecting yet us here in Germany, but it's reality already now. We have high imports from countries in the Middle East or from North Africa to Europe. Talking now from the German industry point of view, we are really willing, and it's amazing to see what kind of momentum we have gained, in the whole decarbonization debate. There's a strong willingness to move, and that, of course, will add even more CO2 cost to our product price. And in order to keep, this technological leadership, we ask ourselves, of course, what would be the right measures, to make sure that we are not undergunned or float away by imports. And honestly, I have to say, I still believe that a carbon border adjustment is a tool that can, phase in, while the CO2 costs go up. And I have, maybe legally it's a tax, but for me, a tax is something, which you add to everything. I'm not sure, but, for me, it's, you price in the CO2 differences, the CO2 cost that has to be implemented, and that is what has an imported cement to pay, when it enters the European border. So I have difficulties, with the no, I should say, it's not the solution that we want, because it has to do. It's always a feeling of protectionism, for example. It's also always a feeling of, you cannot help yourself and you are not technological leaders. But at the end, if you break it down, it's like grasping a straw. So until the time when we have a global carbon market. Once we have a global carbon market, of course, then the whole situation is different. But at this stage, I honestly have to say the carbon border mechanisms is something that we look very intensively at, and we bring ourselves into in that debate on a national, but more important, of course, on a European level. We would like to be listened to, and we would like to strive, together for good solutions. When I say good solutions, it's I fully understand, and I come back to my first statement, that of course there are differences between the various sectors. But for our sector, I have to say, it will really something we would like to look in detail in.
Ms. Fellow, you are here as a taxation expert, so maybe we just take this question once and for all. Is it a tax? Are we talking about a tax?
Yeah, thanks for the question. When you mentioned that, Mr. Schneider, I had to smile because it's a recurring question in that debate. I cannot give you a yes or no answer. It all depends on the design of the measure. And among the different proposals and different options that have been put on the table at the Commission's level, I have to say that some of the proposals to me look like a tax, and some others do not look like a tax. So, the measure could be a customs duties. In that case, it would be a tax, and it's very likely that it would be contrary to international trade law. On the other hand, you also have alternatives that I wouldn't qualify as a tax, that very much look like a complementary measures to the European emission trading scheme. And in that case, it wouldn't be a tax, which would be great from an EU law perspective, because that means it's easier to adopt that measures. You do not need unanimity at the EU level. You can rely on the qualified majority voting requirements. And from the perspective of international trade law, those measures would also less likely violate international trade law, even though the nature of the instrument, whether it's a tax or not a tax, doesn't really impact on whether or not it would be contrary to international trade law. So that's an important point as well. The nature of the instrument might not matter that much at the international level.
So what would be important for the WTO? So when would it be compliant?
Mm-hmm. The main requirement, I guess, is non-discrimination. So you need to make sure that you do not discriminate against imported products. So you need to make sure that the way you apply the measure is indistinctive on domestic and imported products. And that's the key problem, because it's difficult to assess how much CO2 emissions has been released abroad. And it's also not completely sure that you can distinguish between products on the basis of how they have been produced. And the CO2 emissions generated during the production process are clearly linked to non-product related process and production methods. So that could be problematic, but it really depends on how you read the international agreements that are part of international trade law. There are different views on those questions, and some people would say, and I hear what Mr. Oettinger said, that those measures are clearly problematic under the rules of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, for example. Some other people would say, no, you can actually read those provisions in a way that is not as restrictive as some other people do. So again, I'm very sorry that I cannot give a yes and no answer. It very much depends on the design of the measure.
Mr. Oettinger, do you want to respond to that? You have to turn your mic on. Yes.
My question is it really smart to start such a problematic, difficult, and dangerous process? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. But some politicians in Brussels are so offensive. To stop them is meanwhile nearly impossible. They are in a kind of obligation. And let me say, we will have long court proceedings. Long. Our industries need clarity. They have to know what is the legal future. And we will have for 2 up to 5 years no clarity. Great. And my colleague mentioned no discrimination. Indeed, that's it. Discrimination is not accepted from a WTO point of view. And take a country as India or South Korea. If they are accepting for the steel sector or the cement sector higher emissions, but if they are overall on the way to a neutral CO2 future in 2050, if they have a clear outlook and procedure, a clear strategy for to reduce in 2030, 40, 50 down to zero, but they are accepting higher emissions for this or sector or that sector, is it really a European competence to give a tax if South Korea or Japan or India are on the way, are fulfilling United Nations obligations, but they have some flexibility between sectors, between the energy sector, between mobility, between industries. And so we are discriminating them. question over question. And I'm wondering why such a discussion didn't deepen our understanding. I think we have to be careful. And I'm not convinced that in 2023, such a text can be a reality. And a last point, is it so bureaucratic? Do you really think a machine coming from Japan to Europe, 3,000 parts, a truck, 12,000 parts, a car, 10,000 parts, we can by detail analyze it? I'm not an engineer, but I'm sure it's impossible. For commodities, it could be possible, but not clever or smart, not meaningful. For complex products, for a facility, for a machine, it's nearly impossible. Sorry, it's impossible.
Mr. Schneider, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, Mr. Oettinger, that's exactly the case, and you are fully right. I would like to support this. I mean, if you have a car, if you have a washing machine or things like this, I think the producers, they already know that it's not possible to derive a CO2 footprint from this, and that could be then subject to border tax. Yeah, that's clear. And I think these industry don't claim this. And when I listen to what is discussed in Brussels, I think there's an openness, for this. We don't need this kind of border adjustment for all the products. But as you also said, there are the commodities. Yeah, and I wouldn't argue for this. If I had a better solution. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah, and we have. If I talk to my colleagues on a European level in southern France or in Spain or Portugal, even today, they have a significant import from Turkey, from Morocco, and from Egypt. Yeah, there are huge overcapacities. And they suffer, yeah. And the question is, how can we make sure? And that's what you said also. We've got to make sure that our industry can be maintained in Europe. Yeah, we need our industries. And when it comes to CO2, we are still, also leaders in many respects, also in our industries. And I'm working in our industry now since 1991, and the word physicist has been mentioned, a couple of minutes ago. I'm a physicist by profession. I got to love this industry. It's a fantastic industry. It's our society wouldn't be like it is, without cement and concrete. And I really believe, that we should be able to produce it with local materials, with local people, and with local equipment. And you may, if you take an airplane, for example, and you get your baggage from the baggage belt, this belt is built from the Bäumer company, which is in Beckum in Westphalia, and they learned this transports from cement, from the cement industry, this spin-off, from our industry into these sectors. It's amazing. So I fully support your view, but I would argue then in addition to this, maybe there's indeed no one-size-fits-all solution. Yeah. So. But let's open ourselves for discussion on the commodities. And it's too bad that nobody from the steel sector is here. But I know that they also consider this as an issue, at least for crude steel, to make sure that they are not just overflown by imports. In particular, when they go to green steel now. How are we going to achieve this? In transition time, green steel to green cement. How are we going to achieve, that these companies are not just flown away by imports? That's my only concern. Yeah.
Ms. Pirlo, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just would like to pop in on that, because the constant arguments that's coming into the discussion is the argument of the competitiveness, the level playing field, and I totally understand that because you're from the industry and that's what you're seeing. But I just would like to stress another problem linked to carbon leakage. So when you're mentioning those enterprises importing carbons from abroad to the EU, one critical problem, of course, is the competitiveness, but another related problems that would undermine the goal of all our climate policies at the EU level is the fact that we would just relocate the environmental problems to those countries. And we do not want that. We do not want that the European environmental policies lead to higher global greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess that, to me, one key objective of those border environmental measures, those border carbon measures, is an environmental objective. So clearly there is the level playing field objective, there is the competitiveness objective, but there is also this key environmental objective of making sure that the environmental measures that we adopt at the EU level do not lead to more pollutions at the global level. Because if that were the case, we completely undermine the objective of the environmental policy.
Mr. Bublil, maybe a question for you. How can you prevent carbon leakage? Or how will you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you hear me? Yes. Well, that's exactly what we're trying to achieve with the carbon border adjustment. Currently, we have already risks of carbon leakage in certain sectors. Cement is one of them. Steel is another. Chemicals. There are many sectors which are carbon intensive, which products are heavily traded, and which are at risk of carbon leakage. And the solution right now to address this risk is to grant free carbon allowances in the emission trading scheme. And as we raise the ambitions of the EU, we have to explore other ways to address this risk of carbon leakage, because we don't want, as was mentioned by Mrs. Pirlo, to see carbon leakage undermining our efforts and while we put a carbon price in the EU, seeing the production moving outside of the EU in countries where there's no carbon price, where there's no carbon regulation, and in the end, the emissions increasing instead of reducing. So the objective of the carbon border adjustment is to ensure that the price of imports is reflecting the carbon content of the products, so that we have a policy that applies similarly to production in the EU and to imports. And that's very important for carbon leakage, but also for WTO perspective. The policy is not the carbon border adjustment, and the carbon border adjustment is not in itself contributing to climate policy. It is the carbon border adjustment in combination with the EU ETS that ensures that when cement, steel is in the EU, it is subject to a carbon price that encourages reduction of emissions, and that's the idea behind the carbon border adjustment, which I precise is not necessarily a tax, because the question came before. It may be a tax, it may be something else. We are working on several hypotheses, and actually, well, of course, it will have an influence on decision making, and that's important in the EU. But what is even more important is to ensure that we set up a measure which is centered on its climate objective, which is compatible with WTO rules, and which is accepted by our trade partners. The idea is not to punish anyone. The idea is not to. The idea is just to be able to conduct our policies in a way that is efficient.
Mr. Kurz, you don't look like you agree, if you can hear me. Did you hear me, Mr. Kurz? Yes. Sorry, I just ask if you are relieved right now.
Thank you, Ms. Witsch. It's not a question if I agree or not. I'm sitting here silent with open eyes and open ears and listen all the arguments and the response. So, in fact, I agree with Günther Oettinger. I'm wondering how the proposed carbon border mechanism can work. I have no idea. What's a parameter for this? How can we find a parameter, a fair parameter for the tax or for the prices in international market? I'm still looking for an answer of it.
Mr. Boublil, do you have an answer? I mean, a lot talking was about the legality and being with the WTO rules, but some mentioned that there could be a possibility to make it an EU-wide carbon tax. Would that be an option? Would that be a better option, maybe?
Well, of course, there is a possibility to have an EU-wide carbon tax, but that's, we already have a carbon price in the EU, and it is the carbon price that arises from the EU ETS, so from the emission trading scheme. And among the options that we are looking into options, most of the options that we are looking into are trying to ensure that that imported goods support a carbon price which is equivalent to that of the EU, and the one of the EU, the one that is harmonized in the EU, because there may be additional carbon prices in member states, but the one which is harmonized in the EU is the price that arises from the EU ETS. So this is our reference in the EU. This is what we are trying to apply, that we are exploring how to apply it on imported products. We're not looking into cars or computers. We're not looking into very complicated final products. We are looking into commodities. Cement is one of the products that we're looking into. Steel is another one, where we're looking into products which are in the carbon leakage list of the EU emission trading scheme. We're looking into ways to assess the amount of emissions of imported products, and to apply a carbon price comparable to the one that we're having in the EU on this carbon price, taking into account its origin, the production methods, taking into account elements that we may have on these products. But as we were saying, we're looking into products which are standardized enough, which are high enough in the supply chain, and which are very intensive in carbon emissions.
Mr. Oettinger, you wanted to say something.
Just for remarks, but let me say firstly, David Boublil is a great expert on DG. His DG is really reliable, so they do what they can do to avoid problems. Problems are coming not from this DG. Problems are coming from the political sector. And when we started ETS 14 years ago, there was a clear promise that carbon leakage never will be a reality. Meanwhile, directly and indirectly, we have carbon leakage, because these free of charge emissions are not enough to avoid that we are violating the level playing field. But let's be honest, nobody is saying climate change is the priority and forget carbon leakage. But I think this promise ongoing is a reality, has to be a reality. And we need a balanced policy. I don't see a balanced policy. Second point, if there was said, we are looking into commodities, okay. if it's just steel and aluminum and not cars, then steel will be produced in China and cars are coming from China to us. Great, great. We are pushing carbon leakage. If we don't see the whole industrial production, if we see just commodities, we are losing the ground for commodities in Europe because they have to go to China, and machines and facilities and trucks and cars, complete products are coming to us, not analyzed by us and not under the umbrella of such a mechanism or such a tax. And next point, I think we have to fight against bureaucracy. What we are preparing now is so complex and bureaucratic. Nobody will understand it. And this EU, and I love the EU, needs more partners, more supporters. With such a mechanism, we are losing partners, our clients, our citizens, because it's too complex. And the last point, we are isolating Europe because nobody, not in Washington, DC, hopefully Joe Biden, not in Tokyo, not in Moscow, not in Seoul, nowhere else, not in London, not in Bern, will understand it. Is it really, I think we should be ambitious, but not arrogant. It's a part of arrogance, what we are doing now in Brussels, and we are violating our good partnership to many democratic partners all over the world.
Ms. Pelot, I was coming to you anyway, but please go first.
Thank you. I would like to react on some of these points. And the first one is the questions of carbon leakage. So yeah, clearly there is a risk of carbon leakage, but I do not think that there is a total consensus on how much carbon leakage there is at the moment, how much carbon leakage there remains, despite the fact that we still have some free allowances, etc. At least from what I've read in the scientific literature, I do not have the impression that there is total consensus. So I think that's an important point to mention. And clearly it will depend on sector to sector. So that's also something to keep in mind. And the second point on which I'd like to react is the argument of the complexity. So I agree with everyone that has been said regarding the complexity of the scheme. Clearly it's not something that's simple, but climate change is not simple. And if we put climate change as a top priority, we need to find a solution. So if that's the only solutions that we have at the moment, we'll have to deal with the complexity. And I'm fairly confident that we can deal with the complexity because most of the environmental policy that we have are quite complex. The environmental problems are complex issues. And if you think about ozone depleting chemicals and all the policy measures that we've taken a couple of years ago, these measures were also complex, but we've done it. So I hear the argument, but I do not think that it can be used as an argument to just say, let's disregard those proposals. And I'm happy to hear that in the opening speech of Manfred Kurz, you mentioned an alternative. So you said, we don't like the carbon adjustment measures, but we'd like product requirement measures. So we'd like to look at some other proposals. And I think that is constructive because it's basically putting on the table two different proposals that we could look at in order to solve this climate issues at the EU level, but also at the global level. And just to finish on this, so when I look at those two alternative proposals, the carbon adjustment measures and the product carbon requirement proposals, I think that both of them are quite complex. And it might be true that the product carbon requirement is a little less complex than the border carbon adjustment measures. But in any case, complexity, in my opinion, would characterize those two proposals and probably most of the proposals that we are using at the moment in order to mitigate climate change. The European emission trading scheme is also a very, very, very complex scheme. So I don't believe there is a simple solution to that issue.
Before I come to you, Mr. Schneider, Ms. Pelot, the ETS was mentioned a few times now. Are there any other comparable mechanisms that already show that this kind of instrument is working? Could we compare it to something already?
So you're referring to the border carbon adjustment measures?
Yes.
Okay, so no, we don't have any concrete example of a border carbon adjustment measures that has been added to an emission trading scheme. I see that David Bublé is sort of saying no. I have one concrete example, which is the Superfund case in the US, and that's a case that was actually discussed by a GATT panel. So it gives us some insight as to how international trade law would react to a border carbon measure. But I cannot think of any concrete example, to be very honest. But happy to hear from Mr. Bublé.
Mr. Bublé, you have muted yourself. You were unmuted.
Yes, sorry. There is one example of an emission trading scheme with a carbon border adjustment at regional level. That's in California. It's not comparable to what we're considering in the EU because it is only on electricity. So California has an emission trading scheme. And on one specific product, electricity, they have extended it to neighboring countries and neighboring states. And they have an adjustment in including producers from neighboring countries in their emission trading scheme. So that's one example that we're looking into, and there are others. Well, there are others described in literature, but that's one practical experience, and they're very happy with it.
Mr. Schneider, are you afraid that cement is going to come out of China in the future, as Mr. Oettinger was mentioning?
Good question. I tell you two answers to this. First of all, I'm afraid of cement coming from Turkey and Middle East, and this cement is higher in CO2 intensity than our cements are going to be in the next years. When it comes to China, the biggest carbon capture plant in a cement plant is located in China. And I'm afraid, that at a given time, the Chinese will come and import, but with CO2-free cement. Which is then okay because it's a level playing field, yeah. Because then we have the same level of CO2 intensity. But that should allow us, until then, to make our homework. If we are late in this, and I think we should not underestimate the Chinese when it comes to climate protection. I'm just today had a call, with a colleague in China. I'm going, yeah. And then that is a threat, I think, which we have to face, but which we have to face on a level playing field. If it's the case, okay, then we cannot, that we have to face this. But then I would like to be in a position here in Europe in these days, to develop our carbon progress, to make our products better. And in this time, until then, you have to have this protection from cements which don't bear these CO2 costs, like Turkey or Middle East, Morocco, Egypt, I mentioned that. Yeah. So, But having said this, I know that and I listen to this and I listen to myself, I know exactly where all the difficulties are, yeah. But when we only talk about the difficulties, yeah, so and don't strive for a solution, then we won't get anywhere, yeah. So, and I think in these days we should really have the momentum, to really, achieve something. And I'm very much in favor of lead markets for green products. That's Mr. Kurz, that is your proposal. This would be great, and this is a parallel process. But even at the, it's also kind of a border adjustment because the border is at the customer. At the customer, you have to decide, is a product green or not? Is that car greener than the other? Yeah. So, the questions will remain. So, and at a certain time, we will have to answer these questions. Yeah. And we should not block ourselves and develop these kind of creative ideas, And I'm open to the carbon border adjustment. And if at a given time we realize, together with the European Commission that for cement's not going to work because it has so many obstacles, then good, But at least today, I'm open to this, and I would like to maintain my optimism in this, that we will find solutions, because honestly, we can blame Europe for many things, but so far, with the emissions trading scheme, Europe has done a good job. They have always listened to carbon leakage issues. They have addressed it. Of course, the screws are tightened. I know this, yeah, but I felt honestly, in all my discussions with Europe and also with Berlin, that I mean, if you have good arguments, you got to be listened to. But arguments, they also imply that you come up with a certain willingness to move forward and to be optimistic. So please leave myself being optimistic. Yeah, in the time to come. I need this, and I'm pretty sure we will find a solution. And cement could be, one of these commodities. Honestly, I understand for others it's difficult, and it's very easy for cement to describe its CO2 level. We have the benchmark exercise in the ETS, so it can be easily transferred also to imported products. So let's go for it. Then be as I said, optimistic.
Let's all share your optimism, Mr. Schneider. So we talked a lot about how this is going to work and about the complexity of it all. But here is a question from one of our viewers who wants to know who ensures a valid measurement? How and by whom is this controlled worldwide? Could you already answer that, Mr. Bublil? Are you already talking about questions like that?
Well, we're certainly exploring that, and we have the experience of the ETS on these measurements and on this certification. Of course, the ETS applies in the EU, so it's not we cannot copy it to production outside of the EU. But there is a lot of information available that we can use. We can use benchmarks. We are looking at different solutions to have an approach to taking into account the carbon content of imported product, while ensuring that we're not setting up something that is so complex that it will never work, or it will be too heavy or too expensive to. So we are looking at we are looking, of course, that this is a very important element of our impact assessment work at this stage.
But at this moment, you have no idea how you can ensure that China is really using, let's say, not dirty energy for his products that they ship into Europe?
Well, the idea, there are two elements here. One is how to assess whether the products that are coming into Europe are resulting from a clean production process or for less clean production process, and for this we need to look into certification and verification of the process, or to go for approaches which are more applying general benchmarks and applying general rules. The other thing is how do we make sure, and that was already an element that was mentioned by some of the speakers. I think it was former Commissioner Oettinger, who said that there is a risk that all the clean production of some countries is sent to the EU, while the rest of the production is consumed on domestic market of exporting countries. This indeed is something, if it is possible under the design, that would undermine the effectiveness of the carbon border adjustment, and that would result in the form of carbon leakage. So in the options that we are assessing, we are also looking into how we could minimize the effect of this resource shuffling, which is in economic literature one of the possible weakness of carbon border adjustment. So I don't want to, well, I don't want to say at this point whether we're going to into one direction or another. What I want to say, well, what I can say at this stage is that we're really exploring all options, and we're aware of the risk that may exist in setting up a carbon border adjustment. I agree with all those who said previously that it is complex. Yes, it is complex, but we should make sure that it is not more complex than necessary, and that it is assessed against other options to address the risk of carbon leakage in terms of effect.
So you still have some time left to figure it out. Mr. Oettinger, yes, please.
May I speak about the timing, about the sequence? As we hear from David, they are working intensively to come to a non-bureaucratic and reliable proposal. So the timing should be, firstly, the instrument, and secondly, the target, minus 50, 55, or 60%. But what I see is the contrary. In Brussels, they are speeding up the process to come to a target next year. I assume minus 55%. And the instrument is coming later. And nobody knows, is it legally stable? Is it technically feasible? So at least the sequence should be clear. The timing should be clear. Firstly, a reliable and legal instrument. And secondly, a target. This is my expectation.
And of course, we won't have an answer right now for this or for this fears, seeing as this all is a theoretical discussion at this point. So maybe to you, Mr. Schneider, the question, you are the one of the speakers for the industry here tonight. Under how much pressure is the industry looking at climate goals, national CO2 pricing, as we will have in Germany pretty soon, and discussions about this border mechanism? How high is the pressure for the industry?
The pressure is on a European level very high. Maybe it's not as high yet here in Central Europe, like Germany. And the reason is that we're talking about transport of these goods into Europe, and transport has to do with transport costs. And as I said before, you know, our colleagues, our cement colleagues in southern France or in Spain, Portugal, or even at the Belgian coast, you know, they're more subjected at these days, you know. But as more CO2 costs we have, and this is, David, that is an integral part of the ETS, you know, to make CO2 more expensive and the burden higher, as more subject they are to carbon leakage. And of course, you can draw a heat map, you know, that goes from red to green, you know, showing for which CO2 price you can expect cements in all parts of Europe. And then you see the coasts, you see the rivers, and later on, of course, you see, you know, that the whole area is getting redder. So that the pressure is building up, yeah. And the unfortunate thing is that it's building slightly up. Yeah, it's kind of killing me softly. You know that is, you know, you feel all of a sudden, you know, that the burden is bigger, and then there is a grinding plant at the French coast. Yeah, the French colleagues talk about this, and you know, more and more you got infiltrated by this import cements. And at the same time, we have, as Mr. Oettinger rightly said, you know, we have these extreme ambitious targets. Yeah. And I have to say that, you know, we will certainly be able to cope with these targets in order to develop also, and this is carried by developing our technical leadership here. But this really implies that at least for the time until we have a global carbon market, we need somehow this carbon leakage protection. Yeah? And I mean, as I said, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, at least for our industry, is something we would really like to look in deep detail. At the same time, I'm very much in favor, of course, and that could then, you know, also bring another flavor in the discussion to lead markets for greener products. And Mr. Kurz, you are absolutely right. Yeah, we have at least when I can only talk for cement, you know, we have there's no, I mean, we can push these cements, you know, these greener cements into the market, but there's no pull effect, you know. We have, you know, we have an energy saving directive, for example, in Germany, but we don't for buildings, you know, you build a new house and we have certain energy requirements, but we don't have requirements for CO2. Yeah, so this has to be developed, and if politicians, I think, and politics are open for this. So, but this goes in the direction that we have to somehow, you know, frame all these measures together, and the lead markets for greener products is certainly one aspect of this. And this also brings, of course, a difficulty to judge whether the product is greener than the other. Yeah. So, but I think at the end, the carbon footprint will be an inherent characteristic of any product that we are dealing with. At least, you know, for most of them, I would say. And I think we will deal with this at a certain time. I'm not afraid of this, but we should not underestimate, and that brings me back to your question, the pressure. Yeah, that question is pressure building up, the pressure that is building up on energy and CO2 intensive industries. We should not underestimate this, and then have a look at the carbon border mechanism as one of many possible solutions.
Besides the pressure on the industries, there's also pressure on another topic, because we have another question, and that is, aren't tariff wars the automatic consequence to save the European industry afterwards? Ms. Perlot, maybe a question for you?
Yeah, it's a hard question, of course. The thing I'd like to say is that sometimes we consider that the trade war is the direct consequence of the incompatibility with international trade law. So the fact that the measure would, for example, likely be incompatible with international trade law, I do not think that's the case, but some people think it's the case, would then lead to a trade war. But from what we've seen over the past year, I can say that you can have a trade war even if a measure is perfectly compatible with international trade law, because we've seen in the US that some measures were taken simply to retaliate against some political measures that Europe would take, even though those measures were perfectly in line with international trade law. So it's hard to judge on trade wars, because I do not think it's just a legal question. It's very much a political question. And in a way, international trade law is also a political question, because nobody will check that your measure is in line with international trade law unless there is a dispute. So if everybody is happy with the measures you've taken, even if it could potentially infringe some international trade agreements, nobody cares. The problem only arises when some countries are unhappy with the measures you've taken. So that's, and in this case, because those measures are controversial, we should better make sure that they are in line with international trade law. So I'm sorry that I couldn't really answer that questions, but I've just tried to give you some personal thoughts about how we can think about trade wars.
And to prevent that trade war, one of the proposals is to make an exception for certain countries so that they won't do that exactly. And that has been done before. Mr. Bublil, is that an option for this mechanism?
Well, deciding that it would not apply to certain countries without a good justification, and I mean a justification based on science, not on politics, would probably be an issue with WTO rules. So the approach that we're trying to design, it has to be based on fairness, on science. If we introduce politics into it, it will be very, very, very complicated to manage. And to come back on these trade wars risk, we are very much aware of the risk of trade war. We want to design the measure. Well, we will not propose something that is not compatible with WTO and other EU commitments. But we know that trade wars may start on pretexts. It's not necessarily on the design of the measure, and that's why the Commission is willing to engage as much as possible with trade partners across the world to discuss the measure, to discuss its application, not to grant an exemption on a political basis, but to have the most possibly collaborative approach to carbon pricing across the world.
So we have a few minutes left, but we don't have any questions. So I encourage our viewers to please send in their questions if they have any, because we don't have that much time left. But in the meantime, oh, there comes one now. I'm sorry. Oh, I have to translate that 1 second. When European Oh, okay, thank you. If European products become more expensive due to these measures, then these non-EU products will be in higher demand. Later, when European companies go bankrupt and people become unemployed, then it becomes political. That's a strong comment. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I'm happy to. So I like these questions because I think it will give everyone the chance to fully understand what's the objective of those border carbon measures. So let's start by reading the question again. If European products become more expensive due to these measures, yeah, clearly, if we have climate measures, European products might become more expensive. It might be. I see you saying no, Mr. Boblin.
No, I'm not saying no.
So, assuming they become more expensive, the whole idea of the border carbon adjustment measures is that the carbon price or the carbon measures that you adopt on European products is also being applied on any products sold on the European markets. So any products that would come into the European market, regardless of the fact that it's being produced in the European Union or outside of the European Union, would be subject to the same carbon pricing mechanism. And that's why we could hope that if we have those border carbon adjustment measures, no European companies would go bankrupt and people wouldn't become unemployed. So to me, it's clearly a political question. But I just wanted to react on that questions because I think it really gives us the opportunity to explain what's the whole idea underlining the border carbon adjustment measure.
Again, if we are saying, take Chinese products, and maybe 15% of China products are coming to Europe, and they have maybe an energy mix with 25% renewables. They are sending a certificate. Be sure steel and aluminium coming from China is just produced by renewables. And this certificate is not a fake, it's true. And steel for China, and maybe for North Korea, and maybe for Asia as a whole, is produced by coal to power. What can we do? Sorry, at the end, we need instruments which are reliable and functioning. And the whole discussion, for me, makes it clear we are at the beginning of a discussion. What David is doing is really important, but we are at the beginning. I'm sure we need 2 more years to come to a legal instrument. And as long as we are discussing this, to avoid carbon leakage, not for to destroy our industries. We have to see which target is realistic. And 60% is unrealistic, totally unrealistic. That's my concern.
We talked about carbon leakage a lot this evening, but I actually think this is a good question that we got here. How about goods coming from countries and regions with cleaner production or better environmental measures than the European Union? I mean, there are some actually. Do you have an answer for that, Mr. Bublio? Or did you saw?
Well, if your question is, will we adjust the price the other way, meaning paying for these, that's not in our plans. But we're very happy that some countries would have a higher carbon price than we do, especially as we are increasing our own ambition.
And seeing as we only have a few minutes left, I would like to do a quick round and ask every one of you, maybe at the end, to answer this question shortly and on the point, maybe just 1 or 2 sentences maximum. So, do we need a CO2 border tax and why? In 1 or 2 sentences. Ms. Pillow, maybe you first.
I was looking at the questions because I think they're fascinating and they keep coming up. So sorry for that, but yeah, whether we need a border carbon adjustment or not, it all depends on the underlying measures that we want to adopt. So if we have a European emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax, and we believe that carbon leakage is an issue, we need some complementary measures, and that can either be an exemptions for those sectors subject to carbon leakage or border carbon adjustment measures. Between those 2 alternatives, I would probably go for the border carbon adjustment measure.
Mr. Bublio?
Well, I think we need to have an effective carbon price in the EU, and a carbon border adjustment measure may contribute to that.
Very good. Mr. Schneider?
For commodities, as I have said, I think we have to have a good look at carbon border mechanisms. I think they can provide a solution, at least until we have a global carbon market, which then, of course, makes everything much easier.
And Mr. Oettinger?
My expectation is we will have a proposal coming from the Commission, because they have to deliver. I'm not sure, is there a decision by the Council? Is it by unanimity or by a majority? And my hope is at the end, we will have no trade war. And I'm sure a court decision will finish this illusion.
Thank you. So I just wanted, Ms. Pirlo, I find this question very fascinating as well, but I don't think we can make it in time. So maybe this is a good point for another debate coming up soon. And with this, we are already at the end of this debate. Of course, there is a lot more to discuss on the way to this topic, but unfortunately, we only had those 60 minutes tonight. So thank you very much for this very vivid discussion, although online. And the last word should have our host for this evening. And with this, I give the monitor to Mr. Manfred Kurz. Thank you very much.
Thousand thanks to all the participants. As you know, I threw a stone into the water, and I'm very satisfied about the waves it made. So take it as a picture. We have to open our mind. Might be there's not only one approach, but different approaches for reducing greenhouse gases. Might be my proposal is 1 point for a mixture in a legal framework for the future. I'm looking forward to the proposal of the Commission, and then I agree again with Günther Oettinger. Sure, it's not the last discussion about this theme. We will find together for more following up discussions. I'd like to invite you at the time. Thank you for this evening. Stay healthy and take care. Thank you.